Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we continue our three-part off-topic series on Paul McCartney in 1979 and 1980. In part 2, we'll be looking at the very eventful period between Back to the Egg and McCartney II. And this week in these three cubicles, I play some of the new and notable albums from April 1980 when McCartney's single Coming Up was released. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Betamax Blocker for recently having me on his channel for a rollicking discussion of Beach Boys box sets. It was a lot of fun. You can check out the first part of our conversation now on his YouTube channel. That's Betamax Blocker here on YouTube. Thanks again for having me on. It was a great time. When we last left Paul McCartney and Wings, Back to the Egg, their highly touted debut album for Columbia Records, had failed to live up to expectations. It was hardly a failure, having reached number 8 on the US chart, but it hadn't been the mega smash hit they were expecting. In a 2001 interview, McCartney reflected, "In a way, it's quite cool to have a few albums that didn't make it. I mean, I didn't intend for Back to the Egg to be underground, but it's quite nice." It's pretty hard to imagine anybody but Paul McCartney considering a million-selling number 8 album to be underground. It does, though, sort of show his mindset that anything less than a number 1 was a failure. The next new release came on November 16th in the UK and November 20th in the US with the holiday single Wonderful Christmastime. As was becoming standard, there was a promotional video for the single. It was immediately notable as the second Paul McCartney solo single. His first, Another Day, had been released in 1971. Since then, everything had been credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, or some combination of Paul McCartney and or Wings. McCartney was alone on the picture sleeve with a cutout Santa hat and jacket that made it reminiscent of the cover of Bing Crosby's perennial best-selling Christmas album. When I saw it, I assumed that Wings were still a going concern and that this was a one-off special project credited to Paul only. The fact that the promo clip featured all the members of Wings seemed to confirm it. The B-side, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reggae, is a 1-minute, 46-second, utterly forgettable throwaway. As the title suggests, it's a reggae version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It was recorded sometime in mid-1975. Thematically, it was an appropriate B-side. Of all the McCartney B-sides in his career, this one is the B-sideiest. McCartney must have known this would be lambasted by the critics, and it was. On its initial release, it went to number 6 in the UK. In the US, it missed the Billboard Hot 100 entirely. Like so many Christmas songs, it's become a perennial over the years, re-entering the chart at year-end on many occasions. It hit a peak of number 26 on Billboard as recently as January 6, 2024. Of course, that's also made it one of McCartney's most lucrative recordings. Nowadays, the A-side is generally seen as the first release from the project that became McCartney II. It was from those as yet unheard sessions and features some of the same electronic sound. Probably because it was a Christmas single, nobody at the time seemed to look at it seriously enough to think it was heralding any new direction or style. From November 23rd to December 17th, Wings undertake a tour of the UK. With Back to the Egg having completed its chart run, their tour was less about promoting the album and was more about testing the new Wings lineup on the road. A lot of touring was planned for 1980. A tour of Japan had been booked and a US tour was under consideration. The most interesting thing about the UK tour is that, apart from Maybe I'm Amazed, Go Now, Yesterday, and Band on the Run, the entire set was composed of songs they hadn't played during Wings Over America, meaning it was nearly all stuff we hadn't heard live versions of before. They also premiered a new McCartney original called Coming Up. Of course, more about that later. Sometime in the early 80s, I believe it was 1982, the December 17th Glasgow concert was bootlegged in a pretty good double set for the standards of the time that was made up to look like a Japanese import and confusingly called Live in Tokyo. Famously, and as we'll talk about in a minute, Wings never play Tokyo. I thought a better title for this might have been No Nights in a Judo Arena, playing off the Beatles' landmark boot, 5 Nights in a Judo Arena, and of course this was confusingly titled because the Beatles only played Japan for 3 nights. I've always wondered what the Japanese on this actually says. I assume it's gibberish, but I'm not really sure. You can see McCartney in cuffs there on the back in Japan, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. It was a nice set. The giveaway is the Ruthless Rhymes logo on the label. Even that's in color, which was unusual for those days. And there are song separation between the tracks on the album, which is another thing that shows that this was a cut above for the standards of the day. I suspect, or wouldn't at least be at all surprised, if this becomes officially released when we eventually get a Paul McCartney Archives collection for Back to the Egg. After the main part of the tour, Wings play one additional show on December 29th at the Hammersmith Odeon as part of a series of 4 all-star charity concerts titled Concerts for the People of Kampuchea. They play their own set, then appear with a group of all-stars as McCartney's Rockestra. The Rockestra appearance is remembered mainly for Pete Townsend showing up in an altered state, refusing to wear the silver jacket that everybody had been given, and generally making a fool of himself on stage during the entire performance. A double album put together from the Concerts for the People of Kampuchea will be released in March 1981. Wings are scheduled to kick off 1980 with their first tour of Japan. They had tried to tour in 1975, but had been denied work visas based on Paul McCartney's history of marijuana arrests. With that behind them, the group arrive in Japan on January 16th, at which time McCartney is immediately arrested at Tokyo's Narita Airport and charged with marijuana possession and smuggling when almost half a pound is found in his suitcase. He's jailed without bail. The weed had reportedly been thrown in the top of McCartney's bag and not hidden at all. McCartney had already been busted for so-called soft drugs 3 times in the 70s. At the time, I wondered if he thought getting caught in Japan would mean a small fine and a lot of publicity the way the other busts had. It might help restore a little underground cred, which was definitely lacking for him in the wake of records like Wonderful Christmastime. If so, he soon discovered that he was facing the possibility of 7 years hard labor. In the 2001 Wingspan documentary, Looking Back, McCartney offers a different perspective. First, he says that it was stupid and he really didn't understand why he did it, but he says that after the arrest, as worried as he was, he also found himself relieved that he didn't have to do the tour. He speculates that there may have been an element of unconscious self-sabotage in it. The tour, which was scheduled to run from January 21st to February 2nd, is canceled. Programs for the canceled tour can be found. I picked this one up a while back. It comes in this nice cardboard presentation box, something unusual. You wouldn't typically see this in America anyway. Inside is a big, heavy-duty program with a big, thick binding. Pictures of Wings, the Japan tour 1980. Lots of photos. Of course, most of the text is in Japanese, so I really can't tell you much about it. There is a discography for the Beatles and for Paul McCartney, which is in English. I can make that out at least. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and maybe even up to today, I'm not sure, that there were certain high caliber Western celebrities who would never do a commercial in North America or in Europe, who would take big money to do a commercial in Japan, figuring that the commercial would never be seen outside the country. And here's an example of this in the centerfold. You've got Paul Newman for Blendy coffee. It's Blendy Soundmate. I believe it's by Maxwell House, Maxwell Blendy. And the tagline is "Keep Your Smile." And you can see Paul Newman is definitely keeping his smile there. Looks very stern and sour. You'd never see Paul Newman doing a commercial in the West, of course. Of course, later on he did Newman's Own, but he figured that was different because it was a charity and it's a whole thing. Anyway, I thought that was interesting to see Paul Newman in a commercial in a Japanese tour book from 1980. Thought you might like seeing that. Of course, it seemed unlikely that Paul McCartney would actually be laboring away in a Japanese prison until 1987. And on January 25th, after 9 days in jail, charges are dropped and McCartney and his family leave the country. Naturally, the incident is huge news around the world. At some point, McCartney had even announced his intention to give up marijuana. That's the takeoff point for Paul and Linda's taped appearance on NBC's Saturday Night Live on May 17th. Referencing America's ongoing hostage crisis in Iran, Jane Curtin reports on the ongoing crisis of Paul McCartney not having smoked marijuana in 122 days. She takes us to cast member Don Novello in character as Father Guido Sarducci, who is in London to interview the McCartneys, but wasn't aware that the time change meant that he'd be waking them up at 5 a.m. to appear live on the show. Eventually, the McCartneys appear for a short comic interview, followed by the premiere of a high-concept promo video for Paul's new single, Coming Up. For these pre-MTV days, the promo was pretty complex, with McCartney appearing in different guises as all members of a band called the Plastic Macs, and Linda appearing as two different background singers. The Coming Up single had been released more than a month earlier on April 11th in the UK and on April 15th in the US. At the time of the Saturday Night Live appearance on May 17th, the single was at number 19. It'll spend 3 weeks at number 1 beginning June 28th. The B-side is credited to Paul McCartney and Wings, which is only proper since it features a live version of the A-side, Coming Up, recorded at Wings' December 17th concert in Glasgow, plus a previously unreleased instrumental, Lunchbox Odd Socks, recorded in February 1975 during the sessions for Venus and Mars. Importantly, in the US, it wasn't the A-side that went to number 1. It was the live version with Wings from the B-side that Columbia promoted, saying that America wants to hear Paul McCartney's true voice and not the electronically treated voice on the A-side. Because of that, when McCartney II is released in the US on May 21st, Columbia take the unusual step of including a one-sided single of Coming Up live at Glasgow and adding a hype sticker to let buyers know that it's there. I'll give you a little bit better look at this one-sided single. Of course, it's the same track that appears on the B side of the Coming Up single, but here it's just credited to Paul McCartney rather than Paul McCartney and Wings. The other side says, special one-sided single, play other side, and you can see that it's just got no grooves in it. It's just plain flat vinyl. As things transpire, Coming Up live at Glasgow will end up being the last new release credited to Wings, so Paul McCartney and Wings' last single becomes the number 1 hit from Paul McCartney's second solo album. McCartney II wasn't surrounded by the same level of hype that had preceded Back to the Egg, but in some ways it was more highly anticipated. We'd heard plenty of Wings albums at this point and pretty much knew what to expect. A McCartney solo album seemed like it might contain some surprises. Given the low-key, homemade acoustic nature of McCartney in 1970, I even hoped that McCartney might fly in the face of the recent trend toward electronic music that was becoming so prevalent in 1980. Most of the recording of McCartney II had been done in the summer of 1979. Like the McCartney album, he had recorded much of it at home by himself. What was slightly less well known at the time was his home experiments had resulted in enough material for a double album, which had to be pared back to a single by dropping the weakest tracks and editing others from 5 or 6 minutes to 3 or 4. Some of the tracks that were dropped emerged as B-sides, and we'll talk about those next time. Those that remained unreleased and the unedited versions of those that were began appearing on bootlegs in the late 80s and found official release on the McCartney II archive set in 2011. And having heard them, I can safely say that there was not a track dropped or an edit made that didn't improve McCartney II. When McCartney was working on the album in the summer of '79, punk was giving way in large part to the more futuristic keyboard, drum, and electronic sound of new wave. It was a sound that could be heard that summer to a greater or lesser degree on such disparate albums as Talking Heads' Fear of Music, Candy O by the Cars, Duty Now for the Future by Devo, the B-52s, XTC's Drums and Wires, Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division, The Pleasure Principle by Gary Newman with its hit single Cars, and Led Zeppelin had adopted some of that sound on their new album In Through the Outdoor. It was influenced by earlier albums like those by Kraftwerk and by Brian Eno, albums that were enjoying a renewed vogue among music aficionados at the time. Eno's Another Green World always seemed to me to be very much what McCartney was going for with McCartney II. By the time of McCartney II's release, we recently had albums like Lodger by David Bowie, the third of 3 albums on which he collaborated with Brian Eno, Devo's Freedom of Choice, The Buggles' Age of Plastic, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, and Pete Townsend of The Who had incorporated some of that sound on his recent hit solo album, Empty Glass. At the time, and often in later interviews, McCartney has said that the album started as home recordings he made for his own amusement and never intended to release until friends heard the tapes and told him it would make a fine album. I've never believed that. Even for McCartney, there's an awful lot of work here for something he never intended to release. And from everything I've read, from the very beginning, he seems to have been going about it very deliberately. On top of that, his pattern had become to record next year's album during the summer. It's hard for me to believe that McCartney would have spent the summer of '79 working on something that he never intended to see the light of day. I suspect that he felt the huge hype surrounding Back to the Egg had played against him and was reacting by presenting his next album in a low-key, even reluctant way. Wings was very much a going concern when McCartney II was recorded, and though there was now no touring in the immediate future, they were very much a going concern when it was released. I think making a McCartney album was also an attempt to sidestep directly following up Back to the Egg with another high-profile Wings album that pundits would pounce on if it failed to top the charts. For Wings, an album not hitting number 1 or number 2 on the chart would be seen as a failure, like Back to the Egg's number 8. If a new Wings album did worse than Back to the Egg, there might even be news reports that McCartney's career was tanking. With McCartney II, if it failed, McCartney could just say it was a side project and something he never intended to release anyway. It was a nice insurance policy in the uncertainty that followed Back to the Egg. Nevertheless, Coming Up was a promising start to the new album. It was his most solid single in a long time, though it did sound like an extremely good television jingle asking you to stay tuned for what was coming up after the commercial break. It was undeniably catchy, energetic, assured, and enjoyable. Even John Lennon, in an interview for Playboy magazine, called it a good piece of work. Hope you enjoyed this. Next week, we'll wrap up our off-topic 3-part series with an in-depth look at McCartney II. In the meantime, I look forward to your feedback. Please hit like if you don't mind, subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you next time. Have a great week. Bye.